to Mass Insight's Ed Newsmakers Election 2020 and Education Panel. I'm Sue Lusi, the President and CEO of Mass Insight. And before I go any further, I want to be sure and thank our partners, Rasky partners, for helping us host this event. We're very grateful for the technology that they've shared with us. I am pleased and privileged to talk with our panelists today, and it seems particularly propitious that today is the safe harbor deadline for states to certify their presidential electors. So we are well on our way to making this transition. You all should have received bios of our panelists, so I'm only going to provide brief introductions and save the majority of our time for conversation. Going in alphabetical order, Celine Coggins is the Executive Director of Grantmakers for Education. She began her career as a middle school teacher in Worcester, Massachusetts. She's the founder of Teach Plus and is a nationally recognized expert on teacher leadership, education policy, standards and accountability, and union politics. Frederick M. or Rick Hess is a resident scholar and the Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute, where he works on K-12 and higher education issues. He's the author of Education Week's popular blog, Rick Hess Straight Up, is a regular contributor to Forbes and The Hill, and serves as the Executive Director of Education Next. Rick has authored and edited numerous books, and he started his career as a high school social studies teacher. Last but certainly not least, Roberto J. Rodriguez is president and CEO of Teach Plus, where he spearheads the movement to grow and strengthen teacher leadership. Roberto has served in senior roles in both the U.S. Senate and the White House under President Obama, and is nationally recognized for his expertise in education policy and governance, as well as for his leadership in building multi-sector partnerships with schools, families, and communities to improve educational opportunities for all children. Roberto currently serves as a volunteer in his personal capacity on the Biden-Harris transition team, helping to inform and prepare the next administration to advance its agenda to build back better and to hit the ground running at the U.S. Department of Education. It's important that we all understand that Roberto is not joining us today as a representative of the Biden-Harris administration, nor can he speak to the administration's policy positions on education. So Roberto, I think we can anticipate you may get some questions that you are unable to answer for us today, but we have now cautioned everyone. I want to thank all three of you for making the time today to talk with us. I know you're all extremely busy, and as we were about to start, you were talking about the circuit of similar panels that you've been on. So thanks so much for taking the time to be with us today. For the audience, I'm going to talk with our panel for about 45 minutes, and then my colleague John Schneider will join us and will field questions from the audience. So, without further ado, Celine, I'm going to start with you and then ask each of your fellow panelists to further comment, and to the extent you're able to either build on one another's comments and or disagree, let's make this conversation as expansive as possible. So Celine, the incoming Biden administration is talking about building bridges and working together. And I'm wondering what you think this might look like in education, and specifically how the president-elect can build a coalition to support his initiatives going forward.
Sure. So I'll just throw a few things in the mix, and I'm dying to hear what my panelists have to say. So a few things. Number one, I'm hoping that we work our way back to a more centrist agenda. My background, as many of you know, including Sue and John, is I worked in Massachusetts education policy. So I watched in David Driscoll and Jim Pizer a Democrat commissioner and a Republican committee who really had to kind of duke it out and make compromise and, kind of really put the best interest of kids first. So I think that's a fine thing at the federal level. I would love to see on my own agenda, number one, adequate and equitable funding. I think that really needs to be front and center right now at a time when schools have had to spend so much money just to address the pandemic, at a time when we've really seen that schools for so many kids are their shelter, are their source of food. And so we really need to be thinking about that as we head back to school full time. I think we need to put front and center a racial justice agenda that includes diversifying the teaching force, that includes, that additional funding piece, as well as, cultural awareness, bias training, that type of thing. And then I think we're really going to have to look into social and emotional supports for kids. This has been a really hard moment on kids psychologically across the board. Mm-hmm. Then the last thing that I think is a really kind of exciting and important moment to be thinking forward toward innovation is this question of what's the future of hybrid learning? We know we're not going back to the days of classrooms just as we had them. We know that there have been some really rocky times in technology, but that there are some bright spots as well. And so in my mind, that's a really important place for us to be thinking as we think about those basics.
Thank you. Rick, what would you add, disagree with? Go for it.
Sure. Well, great to be with you guys. And MBAE is obviously a model of folks having worked over 3 decades in ways where principled folks find things to work on together in important ways. So hopefully you guys will have a lot to share going forward. A couple of things. Like first, one of the things that I think gets lost, we use a lot of these words like equity, which and racial justice, which for my purposes no longer have any fixed meaning. They seem to mean whatever is useful to an advocate in a given moment. So I think when we get caught up in them, we very quickly find ourselves on the horns of culture wars. And I think to the degree that any educational agenda starts to feel like it is engaging in culture wars, and I think both sides would say the other has done this over the last 4 years, it's very hard to find principled centrism for people to say, all right, we'll have those debates in another forum. So I think one thing that's going to matter a lot is the degree to which there's an ability to talk about problem solving for kids, for families, for schools and colleges, rather in a way that does not feel agenda driven. Second is I think we need to understand those problems broadly. I've heard a lot about equity. The reality is my inbox, and I'm sure the same is true as everybody on this call, is filled up from parents of all kinds of situations who are frustrated as hell. Whether they are two, comfortable suburban families with 2 parents, or whether there's somebody wrestling with these things in rural communities, or whether they're a school choice parent in an urban core. I'll tell you, my emails sound remarkably similar. I can't get anybody to help me out with my kid's not sleeping, my kid's frustrated, my kid feels. These are universal frustrations. And I think to the extent that it feels like the agenda is about how do we help these families? How do we help them do what's right for their kid? How do we make sure that schools are open so that parents who want their kid in a setting with other adults and with kids can get them there? I think there's going to be enormous appetite for bipartisan work. And I think on the policy and spending piece, the data is now suggesting that the fiscal hit on schools is much smaller than we had feared it would be in the spring, because it's much smaller on state revenues generally. There is going to be a call for additional funding. I think we're seeing that in the bipartisan push on the Hill right now. But if the conversation is we need a lot more money and then we'll figure out what to do with it, or even whether to open our doors, I don't think that is going to be a lot of room for cooperation. If the point is there are specific ways to spend funds that are going to solve problems for families and kids across the country, then I think there's going to be a real appetite on both sides of the aisle to support that kind of agreement.
Okay. Thanks, Rick. I have a follow-up question for you, and then Roberto, I'm going to ask you to comment and pull this together. Rick, when you talked about the need to find, or how difficult it could be if we devolve to culture wars, to find that principled centrism. I think often when you're starting an administration, your first moves are really important in signaling what the approach is going to be and in building people's assumptions or changing them. If you were advising the incoming administration, what's a move you would recommend making to communicate that we're going for that principled centrism approach?
It's hard in this scenario because obviously what looks to me like a problematic stance is going to look to people in the president's inner circle like the right thing to do. So it's not so, so for instance, I have an enormous problem with what the president is promising to do on Title IX. It seems to me to unwind careful rule-driven due process on campuses it is hard to justify. But there's people in the president's camp who obviously feel very differently, and so be it. What I would say is that a lot of this, I think, comes down to how you talk about these things. To the extent that the president and his team are going to move on something like Title IX, are going to move on, the Office of Civil Rights is going to take steps that to some of us on the right might feel problematic. I think it very much depends how these things are talked about, how they're explained, who is doing them, and where they fit side by side with larger agenda items. And I think part of the problem is when these are being done in isolation and one doesn't get any reassurance that they either only are going to go so far or that they are part of a broader agenda, which also has more centrist components. People like me see very worrisome signs. So it's not so much that I would deign to tell the president do or don't do something you believe in, but as we've seen over the last 4 years, how you do things also matters enormously.
Yeah. So Roberto, I'd love to have you share your thinking on the question about how the incoming administration can build bridges and a coalition, and comment on anything your colleagues have said, and just take it away.
Sure, Sue. Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I just want to thank you and John and Mass Insight for all your leadership. One of the connections to my bio that we didn't get a chance to mention was my 8 years of service under the late Senator Ted Kennedy. Yes. In the Senate, and he was such a champion of education, of students and families and parents. He understood educational opportunity, but he also was served in a Senate that really put a high priority on working together and working across the aisle, and he was a model for that work. We learned a lot from the great effort of the mass reform back in 1993, and how that took shape and really modeled a lot of the work with President Bush on No Child Left Behind, focused on that. So, I just want to acknowledge how important that history and that context is to where we are today, because there's a reason Massachusetts is leading the nation in terms of achievement and the rigor of their standards, and that has to do with that work, that coming together around the closing the achievement gap, and supporting high quality standards-based reform, and serving alongside Senator Kennedy. I had a chance to see then Senator Biden and his commitment to bringing people together. He is a leader who really enjoys rolling his sleeves up and working across the aisle to solve complex challenges, to get things done. He listens intently and deeply to the needs of the folks that he's working on behalf, and to others that he's working alongside. So I think that spirit that he embodies, I certainly personally am excited about that, because I think it, and I agree with my colleagues here on the panel, I think there's tremendous opportunity for working across the aisle to try to solve some of the challenges that we have in front of us. First and foremost on COVID. And the work that the country has to do to recover and restart across our education system, from early childhood, our child care and early preschool programs, to our K-12 system, our challenges in our higher ed system. We have a lot of work to do to provide that, provide for the health and safety of our communities, make sure that we are partnering actively with mayors and with governors and at the local level to restore the trust and confidence of families in being able to come back and in securing their health and their safety. But I think that the president-elect really understands that, and I think that he's going to be very focused on the recovery effort and the relief effort around COVID, and very hopefully very focused on working across the aisle to get that done. And then there's so many components of the plan that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris discussed on the campaign trail. So many components of that agenda that I think lend themselves to bipartisanship. Whether that's thinking about how we expand our early childhood system. We have governors, from the Republican Party across the country who have done a lot of work to think about how to expand preschool, how to expand early childhood education. How do we think about moving forward to evolve our system so that it is more focused on the needs of our learners and more on the needs and their future beyond high school, right? So that we're preparing those young people early for success in college, but also in careers and for citizenship. And you look at the work around the career and technical education system, for instance, and the president-elect's call to expand career and technical education. That is something that I think a lot of state leaders agree is an important economic imperative alongside supporting students and their future. We need only look at the oversubscription of CTE in Massachusetts as an example of what we can do to blend high rigorous standards for post-secondary education alongside work-based learning and career readiness and pathways for success. So, and there are many other components, I think, when we look at strengthening the teaching workforce and doing more to build a stronger teaching profession, when we think about how to expand our community college system and support greater pathways to post-secondary attainment, and many other components as well. So I look forward to seeing the next administration move some of those priorities forward.
Okay, thanks. So Roberto, I'm going to stick with you for a minute, and I'm going to bring us back. All of you have referenced the pandemic and the current impact, and also looking to the aftermath. So John King at Ed Trust refers to the twindemics of COVID-19 and systemic racism. And these twindemics have put a more glaring a spotlight that is more glaring, I think, now than ever on the enormous inequities in our school systems. And Celine, you mentioned, the need for funding. Rick, you mentioned the basically rampant frustration of parents. There was an article, as a former superintendent, there was an article in the New York Times over the last few days, a pretty devastating article about the level of teacher burnout in our in our systems. We have kids, when I participate in some of the superintendents' equity roundtables in Boston Public Schools, virtually of course, you know, we have everything from kids really engaging to kids who never log on, some of whom are working to support their families, some of whom don't have technology, et cetera, as you look around the country. So what advice do you have for the administration in response? Because people then talk about, you know, we're going to emerge to this new normal. Celine, you referenced the, you know, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with hybrid learning. And I agree with that. And yet I'm really conscious of where some of these systems are now and the conditions facing kids, families, and educators. So putting all of that on the table, Roberto, what are some concrete steps you might recommend?
Well, you know, there's no question, Sue, that there's just tremendous need across the country. And, you know, as John points out with the point around looking at the effects of this health pandemic alongside the moment of racial reckoning that we're facing as a country, and thinking about how to really focus on some of the inequities and barriers to opportunity that still exist in our system. I think it really calls us to do more, to be more explicit in responding to those, take on some of those challenges head on. But first and foremost, thinking about how do we partner more effectively with our state and local leaders in reopening our schools and getting back into the classroom for our students. We still have, just in the conversations I have with so many of our teacher leaders at Teach Plus, and I know Celine knows and connects with our teachers around the country. I mean, there's just the challenges that they are facing really are unprecedented. You have folks trying to teach online on one computer with poor connectivity. We still have a digital divide. That means that there are tens of thousands of students who don't have access to high-speed internet, that are going to McDonald's or to Starbucks to try to make sure that they can connect with their teachers and get their homework done. We have challenges around navigating that remote learning environment, challenges around mitigating the health and safety issues within our schools, and you know, I will say, you know, from my perspective, we have more funding that has to be delivered to our schools to be able to fully recover from this pandemic. So I think that first and foremost is job one. I also think we're in a moment where parents are able to better appreciate and see the relationship that their students, that their children build with their teachers. And I hope that can be a moment where we can open a national conversation about the importance of those relationships to the well-being and success of our students, never at the expense of focusing on their academic success, but rather as an enabler to address some of the social, emotional, mental health needs that they might have. Obviously, those are exacerbated during this time, but we do need more supports, more social workers and school counselors and others in our schools to support that, and more adults that can attend to those needs of the whole child in our system. And I hope that, and I'm confident that, you know, on the other side of this pandemic, we'll be able to, if we can learn from what's working around building those relationships, around teaching in non-traditional environments, thinking about competency-based education, thinking about opportunities to utilize innovative ways to assess and monitor student progress, to deliver content and grade-aligned learning, you know, outside of the classroom to complement the classroom learning. Some of these things we should be thinking about for the future of education. We should be thinking about how can we embed some of those lessons from this pandemic in a way that is added value for kids long term.
Okay. Thank you. Celine, what are your thoughts? So you had referenced the funding, the racial justice issues, social, emotional, and all wrapped up in a centrist agenda.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
So I feel like in the first 100 days, there are three kind of controversial areas where the president and the administration inevitably has to weigh in some way. So number one is around vaccines. Like, are teachers going to be at the front of the line? Are they going to be required to get the vaccine early? Are kids going to be required to get the vaccine early? Are they going to be required to get back into school? So that question about kind of schools and vaccine, inevitable, really important, really controversial. Testing is another one. We're kind of in a quagmire on testing. And this question of, how is the Biden administration going to approach testing overall, I think is really consequential and unavoidable. And the last one is just around funding and the federal role. So the federal role in education historically has been to address the inequities that exist in the system. Is that going to be the primary push around funding and funding out of USED? Those to me are like the first signals that I'll be looking for, the first questions that we can't avoid getting some glimmers on in the first 100 days.
Okay, thanks. Rick, your thoughts?
Sure. I mean, I think when we think about responding to the pandemic, I think there's 5 pieces. Celine and Roberto have pretty much sketched most of these. Washington has a role in some of this, some of it. One is, I think, obviously when it comes to the science of this, and I think Washington has a role there. And honestly, I think we have failed kids and families miserably. We have not followed the science. We should have had kids back in school late August, September. Even as we look at data out of Texas or New York City now, we see positivity rates that are 1/15th, 1/20th of those of the larger community. Schools, it turns out, as we've seen consistently from data from Europe and otherwise, is that if folks are masked, if people are socially distanced, if we're taking sensible measures, schools are probably a safer place for kids to be, because it puts them in an orderly environment where they're actually getting some of these supports, and you might actually lower the rate of overall community transmission. So one, I think we have failed miserably at either reassuring teachers, running clear, directive, responsible safety protocol systems, and getting the word to teachers and school staff. And I think we have failed family. And I think that has certainly falls on the Trump administration not playing its role. But I also think a lot of this has been political backlash led by the teacher unions and staff groups that have pushed back in ways that have been hugely unproductive and hugely irresponsible. Second, Roberto mentioned the human connection. I was writing about this back in the spring. I think all of us who've worked in education know this intuitively, that schools matter so much because they are human places. Kids need role models, they need adults, they need friends. And, honestly, whether you live in a comfortable suburban house or you're stuck in a small down at the hills apartment, you need those experiences and you need those relationships. And I don't know that it's about race or class. Third, I've been disappointed in terms of the agility of school systems. We had about 24 former state chiefs, bipartisan panel of federal officials, SUPs work with us back in the spring. In early May, we came out with a blueprint to help folks get back to school, talking about a lot of the decisions that need to be made, certainly in Washington, and we did not see those made, but also in states and districts. And I think when we came back to school, whether we're talking about the fact that half of teachers received any training in remote delivery of instruction this summer, whether we saw the absolute lack of creativity about memoranda of understanding, about scheduling, about using support staff, I was just enormously disappointed that school districts seem to want to run online what they're used to doing, rather than ask, how do we take our assets and make sure they're configured for kids? Fourth, again, the point Roberto made is the connectivity, the hardware point. And we know that we've lost way too many kids, 10, 20%, depending on counts, have fallen off our radars. A big part of this is connectivity. And here is obviously where class comes into it. those suburban homes are much more likely to have good broadband than folks in tougher circumstances. And obviously, this is a place where Washington can and should step in a very significant way. And fifth and finally, look, one of the things I've been disappointed by as I've done trainings with teachers and school and system leaders this fall is they will say, they'll say, look, we don't want kids in front of the screen all day, which I heartily agree with. I got a first grader who's spending 6 hours a day in front of a screen, 20 feet away, and I hate it.
Yeah.
And therefore, they say, therefore, we only want to have 3 hours of synchronous instruction. And so therefore, the teacher workday becomes 3 hours with an hour of office hours twice a week or something. This is insane to me. How do we go and look at an MOU so we make it clear that the expectation for teachers is we want them to touch every family at least twice a week? I don't care if it's a cell phone, if it's a text. How do we think creatively about the role teachers are playing? How do we think about who's good in a classroom and who's not good in a virtual environment? How do we reallocate responsibility? Is there a role for Washington here? Actually, probably yes, in terms of supporting research, in terms of supporting dissemination. But this is actually, once again, a place where I've been really disappointed, whether we're talking districts or charter management organizations or ed schools. The fact that we're going into month 10 of this, and we have seen as little as we have seen of people actually asking, how do we figure out how to make sure kids are getting the best use out of the talent, the skilled professionals, the support staff that we're already paying for, has been to me a place where we have, not risen to the challenge in a way I might have hoped.
Mm-hmm. How would you, so given that we haven't risen to the challenge as you described it as of yet, how would you approach that? So, January 20th, there's the swearing in. What should happen next?
Honestly, for me, one piece of this is there's 30 to 40% of kids who haven't been in school since mid-March. If those schools and districts tell me they need more money to do what they're doing, I'm just not convinced. If you're actually opening your doors, you've been running a deficit, I'm wide open. If you're telling me you've been running hybrid, you're doing all you can, but you need the dollars Roberto and Celine have been talking about because you need more PPE, because you need more modification, I'm there. So for me, this has got to be very much about a partnership between folks who are running schools, running systems, and folks who are stepping up with the cash. So if you tell me that you want to actually figure out, we know some kids are, we've lost some kids. We know that some kids are academically way behind where we want them to be. It's easy to talk blandly about tutoring, about supports, about in-school staff who may or may not see those kids until September 2021 or later. Again, I'm not real excited about lawmakers ponying up tens of billions of dollars for folks to keep doing what they've been doing. I've run the numbers on this. It seems to me, if this is what we're doing, I don't know any district, the current revenues shouldn't cover it. But if you're telling me you want to think creatively about how do you take some of your most talented teachers, give them a chance to become 12-month employees, get them first in line for vaccination, and then get them out in the community running tutoring centers this summer. If you want to talk to me about how do you use district resources to create supplemental pods, and just nodding to Celine and Roberto's point, put a thumb on the scale for families who can't afford these things for themselves, and make sure that you're doing everything legally possible to notify these families and help them form these support. Then I am, so what January 20th, what I would love to do is see the administration push forward a deal which says, look, we've said we're going to come up, we want to promote big dollars for schools, we want to build back better. Part of building back better is that the schools and systems we're offering dollars to have to show up ready to dance. And they got to show up clearly and forcefully with plans that say how these dollars are making a difference for the kids and families they serve. And I think that would be a really healthy departure from what we've heard on the right and the left over the last 10 months.
Celine or Roberto, I want to give you a chance to respond to what Rick said if you would like to, and if you would prefer, we can go on to the next set of questions.
You want to go
Go,
first?
go.
Rebecca? I'm just
Yeah,
gonna do one quick thing, which is,
please.
so, you know, I think this moment for me has been such a wake-up call to, you know, the equity issues that exist in schools and in urban schools are even greater than I even realized in some ways. You know, as I talk to people in my personal life about my work life, I think it's self-evident that, wow, look at the great need that exists right now, especially for so many young children who are living in poverty. What you hear from suburban families, I just went on a walk with a friend in a W town, since we're just talking about Massachusetts, and, you know, what you hear from suburban families is exactly what Rick is saying, like you know, but my kid only has a pod and only goes 2 days a week, and we need more in the suburbs. And so, you know, so I'm under no illusion, and I think no one who works on educational equity should be under any illusion that it will not be just as brutal a resource fight as it ever has been between those who have but have lost a little now and those who have really been in crisis during this period. That's all I'll say.
Thanks. Roberto.
I think it's a really powerful point you raised there, Celine, and that's where I was going to go as well. Is I would love to see us prioritize equity and focus on making sure that we are not losing any student out of this crisis. And one of the things that's resonant for me from Rick's comments here too is just, you know, we need an all hands on deck approach to be able to reach all of our students and make sure that we are not losing them over the course of this pandemic. We know that there are students who have received little or no instruction since the spring, who don't have access to digital learning, who don't have access to other adults to continue to support their development and growth and their academic success over the course of these months. So, you know, this pandemic really does lay bare the disparities in our communities, and those disparities far beyond our education. You know, what the realities of our education system around housing, around income security, around food security. Around transportation, around healthcare. So we are living these starkly different realities based on, often based on the income and needs in our zip codes. And those have consequences. Those realities have consequences for our students. So what we need is a all hands on deck approach to make sure that we don't lose any. I'm very worried about, you know, and this is just based on the conversations I've had with teachers, that they're worried their students aren't going to come back next year in high school because their parents lost their jobs, and they're thinking, well, I'm going to have to drop out and help support my family. You know, I see our teachers showing up. I think they need, you know, they are showing up every day for the, and this goes to your point, Sue, and I see it, I see that as well. The level of burnout I'm worried about because they're showing up with little training, with few tools in the toolbox, but with their call and commitment to serve their kids. That's why they entered the teaching profession, and they're coming every day, but they need an education system that's also going to show up. And I think is going to attend to the equity gaps that we see in our system. I would like to see us collect, and I'd like to see our districts collect more methodical data on what are the disparities that we are seeing, what are the gaps looking like around access to high quality education, around access to healthcare, to food, to all a multitude of indicators. And let's look at those gaps by income and by race and by English learner status and by disability. And then let's mount an effort where we're focused on beginning to close those gaps with more research-based and evidence-based approaches that will help our students gain back the ground that they need as a result of this pandemic.
Okay, thanks. So now I'm going to do a lightning round. I'm going to ask each of you a different question, and hopefully We can be somewhat concise so then we get to the audience questions, but I want to just get a few more things on the table. So Celine, from your stance now in the funding community, how might a Biden administration change the investment portfolios of our major funders and foundations in the area of education?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. So number one, every funder wants to change and help the world, right? No funder, even Bill Gates, has enough money to do it alone. So an aligned administration is something that is desirable. Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think two things. Number one, we saw that during the Obama administration. We saw a lot of oars rowing in the same direction, which is generally a good thing. Funders were enthusiastically supportive of the Obama administration's agenda generally. It resulted in some good reforms. I will say, I think it's really important right now as we go through this transition for us to have some discussion among funders around what were some of the lessons learned, because the issues that were front and center during the Obama years, so school choice, teacher quality, standards and accountability, those have been dropped by and large by the funding community like a hot potato. It was the first thing I saw when I came into GFE was these are issues that were really high in our surveys in 2008 through 2015, and now we don't fund them anymore. And so, and when I asked people why, some people said it was federal overreach. Some people said we tried to do too much too fast. Some people said we had the wrong agenda. Some people said the science tells us to move in a different direction, like pre-K and SEL. There's no comprehensive set of lessons that would guide us from kind of the years where Biden was the vice president to now the years where he's the president. And so I really do think it's important, and this is what I'm trying to drive in my community of funders are, like, what did we learn and how do we take the best from what we learned to be supportive of the next administration? Some of these things now, funders are somewhat out of step with parents. So I just saw something that Bellwether put out today that said parents through the pandemic now have become more supportive of school choice. Generally, what we're seeing among funders is less interest, or at least funders in my network, less interest in school choice. And so we need to reconcile some of these things because it really is going to be important to the way we think about the future of education. I see a future that has more hybrid models, has more choice models that probably incorporate technology. We haven't done that all that well in the past. Maybe we could use funders' help to get us to a better place in the future, but there's a lot of work to be done in between.
Thanks. Rick, you're someone who's talked a lot about the advantages of choice, and I'm wondering how you think about melding those advantages with a labor-friendly administration, because unfortunately, at least in my experience, often choice and labor unions are at odds.
No, Lily Eskelsen Garcia and I used to get lunch every month or two, and if you know Lily, it would be 90% Lil and 10% me, and we'd talk about this. So we may rehash those conversations, it looks like. No, you're right. There's fundamental tension here. I think there shouldn't be. In Cage Busting Teacher, Roberto shows up there frequently, Celine does. For me, one of the powerful things about choice is it's about empowering education, as Roberto mentioned, is hugely relationship driven. It's real people. We've got 50-odd million children in this country with very different dynamics and needs. One of my deep concerns about when we racialize so much of the talk about diversity is I worry that it crowds out all of the other kind of obvious realization about how different kids are in ways that have nothing to do with pigmentation or kind of country of origin. But schools are hugely relationship driven because children are so fundamentally different. And that means a school that may work great for one child may not work for another. A teacher who might be inspiring for one kid might be intimidating to another. So for me, part of the power of choice is that rather than trying to play that Goldilocks game of just right for every child in the city of Boston or Providence, it's about creating opportunities. And for me, the same logic applies to teachers. All of us who've been teachers, I think, we come at the work with different assumptions, with different values, with different classroom techniques. And some of those are going to work different in different school environments. And so part of that empowerment of choice should be empowering educators and empowering professional staff to find places where they can do their best work. So that if you're a teacher in Boston, you don't have to work for VPS, but you can work for a school that reflects your own deep assumptions about the work, like in any other profession, whether you worked in medicine or architecture or accounting or law. The reality, of course, is that Choice has done a very bad job of articulating this or of inviting in educators, so I don't expect it to play out that way. But I think that, that's an important part of this. Fundamentally, look, the reality is what Celine just mentioned, as we've seen across the board. Parents want more choice. This is particularly true that the folks who want the most choice, of course, are urban Black and Latino parents, according to most of the polling data. The folks who've historically worried least about it are suburban affluents. But what you are seeing now over the last 10 months is suburban affluents starting to look more like urban parents because they're frustrated. I would just say this is one place where I have enormous affection and respect for Roberto and Celine. So I get what they're saying about equity. However, I would caution everybody on this call that it feels a little bit like the No Child Left Behind era in reverse. During the NCLB era, there were a bunch of well-meaning people who wanted suburban parents to listen to these test scores. And this was the same with the teacher evaluation push. Your teachers, your schools aren't as good as you think they are. And it turns out that people eventually say, nah, I don't think your fancy numbers know what the hell you're talking about. I actually like my teacher, I like my school. Right now, what I hear a lot of people when they talk about gaps is they're saying to suburban parents, you think your kid's a victim of educational malpractice. You think your kid is socially isolated and being ill-treated. You think your kid's not learning anything. Nah, actually, you don't realize how good you have it. The people we really need to worry about are over here. And I think if that becomes the bedrock assumption of education improvement over the next couple of years, is it will fail miserably. And frankly, I think it'll deserve to fail because I think education improvement works best when it's inclusive, when it meets the needs of all families and all kids. And I'm worried right now that we're setting ourselves up for a different kind of approach.
Okay, thanks. Roberto, last question before we turn it over to John and the audience. For some time now, we've said, the we being ed reformers, policymakers, others, that we need to prepare all students for college and career. And should our thinking on what we're aiming for all students be changing in any way? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's a great question, Sue. And I do think that what we're aiming for should change.
Okay.
And that is not to say that we shouldn't aim for college readiness for all kids, and for a high level of preparation for their success and for their future. And I just reflecting on some of Rick's comments here, I think we need a system that listens more to our parents and that also connects to their voices and their lived experiences and those of our students too. And that was one of the big challenges with Common Core as we pursued that college and career ready standards in the Obama years. Still I believe one of the most important transformational things we could do for our education system, but important to listen and involve parents and community in that. I think we've put these standards in place, but we haven't listened to the needs of students and their realities in terms of how we prepare them at a deeper level for their future. We don't have a secondary school system in middle and high school. We don't have enough systems that ask our students and engage them truly in their own interests about what comes next after high school. How do they begin defining their future, their opportunities to be able to go to higher education, to pursue post-secondary credentials, right? We know that 8 out of 10 new jobs require some level of post-secondary education. But I think we've been too narrow in describing and defining what that path is for our students. We don't have enough of a opportunity to create more future-ready high schools that are engaging students' interest in real-world, hands-on learning, project-based learning. We've not built on that foundation of academic readiness, an additional sense of how we support career readiness for our students, how we think about their collaboration, critical thinking skills, their analytical skills, their ability to work with others in groups, their ability to think about defining and problem solving in real world challenges, their exposure to learning outside of the classroom and how that can enrich. And we have a system that still has not evolved to a competency-based system where we're able to give students credit for what they know and are able to do and build upon that. So we have a lot of redesigning to do there. And I think if we could aim toward a system that prepares every student with some amount of post-secondary readiness by the time they graduate, right? And is giving them access to early college high schools and dual enrollment programs and opportunities to transition more seamlessly with college credit, and gives them access to industry recognized credentials earlier and access to work-based learning and career readiness and success. I think we would be empowering our students. We'd be evolving to more of a learner-centered design in how we think about college and career readiness as a country.
Okay, thank you. John Schneider, I'm going to invite you to join us. And I want to encourage people in the audience to put questions in the chat if you haven't already.
Thank you, Sue. And we do have some great questions from the audience. Here's the first question. Where have you seen creative responses to 1, technological divides, and 2, measurement of student progress?
Well, I'll just really quickly, the connectivity piece, John, that, I think we've seen such creative solutions brought about, I think, from a lot of our teachers and our school leaders, putting routers on buses, being able to try to deploy hotspots to more of their students. I was talking to one of our teachers the other day, one of our teacher leaders who advocated for her system to be able to let her students keep their laptops over the summertime. And she teaches right along the US-Mexico border. So she had her students able to connect up and stay connected and keep up with their studies even at home across the border. So, I think there are a lot of pieces there. The challenge is that the infrastructure, access to the internet and to connectivity, high-speed broadband, and the devices that we need to be able to do that, so that, I'm not a student that's competing with my 2 brothers and sisters to be able to use use the family's iPhone to be able to connect with my teacher. Those are the types of challenges we need to be bringing ourselves up into the century. We have a lot of work to do to build that, and I think there's great proposals in Congress, expansion of the E-rate program to try to do more of that.
I would just add, I don't think this has been done in Massachusetts. In California, the Ed Trust West did this really fascinating kind of county by county and within county map of where do students have access to broadband, where do they have one-to-one device support, like each of the different layers of issues that inhibit success with remote learning, so that you really had a sense of the scope of the problem, where the problem needs to be addressed, how the problem needs to be addressed. That level of granular detail is essential to being able to solve system level problems. And then I would just say on the creative responses, I'd echo Roberto. It's individual teachers, and it's individual teachers doing kind of double or triple what they might typically do. I have a daughter who's in an AP statistics class, and the teacher, they're only supposed to actually teach like with their face teaching. I don't know, besides assignments, I guess, every other day. And he makes them do it every day. And, you know, he's there and he's in the mix solving problems with them, and they're getting a year's worth of learning. And what you see is that the rest of them, you know, they're not getting a year's worth of learning and everything else. So, you know, it is individual teachers, but we need to ask that question of, you know, what is sustainable in the long term? How would we do this better? How, you know, who's doing it arguably better than others? In this case, you know, some kids are going to pass the AP test and some kids are not. And that's valid information that we should be thinking about going forward. So that's my 2 cents on that question.
The second part of that question was on measurement of student progress. And I personally think that that's a huge issue. And I know that testing and assessment is controversial, and I get it, but it has provided some incredibly important data. So any thoughts about creative responses to the measurement of student progress?
So, I mean, I think NWEA has been invaluable here. RAND is doing some important work on a IES project to try to figure out how to crosswalk some stuff. This is why it's hugely unfortunate, I think, that we've pushed back a long-term NAEP year. And why I certainly hope states will assess in the spring, not for accountability purposes, but because we do need that kind of sense of what's happening with the kids. But frankly, I'll say this actually, I think, is an opportunity for us to think about the state of education research also, because we have, 100+ universities with major research-oriented research-oriented schools of education. We spend, not nearly as much as we spend in medicine, but we spend, a non-trivial amount on education research. We have major foundations who have made enormous and admirable investments in this. And yet, when you look around the American education research community, we are simply not up, we simply don't have people who see their job as being to figure out how do you develop useful, practical assessments to step up. So we're 10 months downstream, and whatever frustrations I have with people who are actually serving kids every day, I'd say are fivefold with people who've had 10 months to think about this as a research question. And they seem, in my experience, more interested in figuring out how do they translate their usual research agenda into the current environment than how do they ask questions that are actually helpful in the here and now.
I would just say one thing about this question, and NWEA, yes. The early story headline of the spring was learning loss, learning loss. There are some headlines coming out now that say maybe the learning loss is not as great as we thought, and then in a footnote, but we only have 40% of the sample, and the part of the sample that we're missing is the low-income kids, the kids in high poverty community. So we just have to be very, very cautious about going to the source, reading all the way through, and making sure that the conclusions we're drawing are appropriate to the population. Maybe it's the case that well-off kids aren't losing as much learning, but kids in high poverty situations are, and we've got to be very sensitive to that as we think about funding and we think about remediation going forward.
Well, and on the research point, one of my takeaways from what Celine's saying is that's exactly right. And it's astonishing to me that when you look around the American education research community, especially folks who focus on assessment and measurement, that 10 months in, we don't have folks saying, here's how we're going to track those kids down. Here's how we're going to do a stratified random sample of assessments to figure out. That's not part of the conversation. It's NWEA did this, shoot, a lot of folks didn't test. Oh my gosh, what else could we do? And that is just when we talk about being there for teachers, for schools, this is when the research community needs to be there. And it doesn't even seem guilty about the fact that it's missing in action.
Great, thank you. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Roberto.
John, I was just to jump in on this. I mean, I do agree. I think that we can do a lot more with the research community. We also need a broader national effort to define a next generation of assessment here, and to define and cultivate more innovative tools for how we measure student progress. We need that for the classroom. We need that for the utility of classroom teachers for teaching and learning. We need that for the evolution of our accountability system. Ultimately, you know, we should be thinking about how we evolve that system over time. And, you know, I think, you know, I agree, NWEA, great, you know, adaptive assessments. You have interim assessments and other states and districts moving in that direction, but not nearly the amount of support that we need to learn from the best, to tap research, to be able to pilot some of these more innovative models in our system. And you know, I think we have to also, it's important to make sure we don't lose sight of the need for that data and for measuring where our students are so that we can better respond to their needs. So it's hard to do that right now in this pandemic. And certainly, I think the validity and reliability of the summative statewide assessment, as we've noted in the past, is not, for accountability decisions, is nearly impossible right now, given that we are in a completely different world order than we have been ever before in terms of our kids taking some of these tests from home. But I think it's still important to collect this data. So, and then to think about what should the future look like for assessment. So I hope that we can begin that process, that conversation coming out of this pandemic.
All right, let me move on to the next question. We had a member of our audience who took a little issue with how is it possible that the experiences of a student in a, quote, in a big house and in a small apartment, end quote, are being compared here. So this idea that we're comparing the experiences of students in a big house and in a small apartment, you know, how are we comparing those experiences?
I mean, simply that they're both human beings, that some of the dynamics of being a 9-year-old are the same wherever you live and some are different. The kid in a large house with good web connectivity and a lot of resources has a different experience in a lot of dimensions. But if those children feel stripped of friends, if they're in a household where parents are abusive or alcoholic, if they're in an environment where they are having depressive thoughts or are scared and they don't have anybody they trust to share that stuff with, it doesn't really matter where you live. These are experiences that children share. So it's in that sense. What we need to make sure we're doing is we're not treating children as little stereotypes or little caricatures. Children are human beings. They're very vulnerable, sensitive human beings with very different needs, and their living conditions or their race or their economic status are part of who they are, but that's certainly not the entirety of who they are. And it's a huge mistake if we presume to treat them as identical or as a completely different based on some of these external variables.
And Rick needs no backup, but I will say, you know, policy and what we've got going forward in terms of where we land with education is largely a contest of resources. And so every parent feels like their kid has gotten less, and the well-off parents aren't necessarily, this was my awakening on my walk the other day, aren't comparing their kids to other kids, maybe who have less. They're comparing their kids to their kids of last year and saying, I want more for my kids to catch them back up to where they might have been. So that's the resource contest that we've got on the horizon.
Roberto, any thoughts?
I would return, John, to my earlier point, which is that I do believe that this pandemic is creating vastly different realities based on privilege and economic positioning in society. I mean, the education that our affluent parents are able to afford their kids at home with high levels of connectivity and wraparound tutoring and pods and all of these things, that looks vastly different from kids who are in homes that are struggling to put food on the table. So, you know, I don't know about the comparison around one kid to another kid. I think that, you know, we need to start to live up to our fundamental principles as a country to really provide for all kids. And that's about putting equity at the heart of this, making sure that every kid has the support and their family has the support that they need to be able to weather this.
Great. Sort of moving on to the next question. This is from a colleague who also happens to be a member of a school committee, a school board. And she asks, what will it take at this point in the pandemic to get the kind of union district collaboration necessary to get more students back to in-person learning?
Well, I mean, I think this is, we all need to prioritize cooperating and putting the needs of our students first, and also recognizing the needs of our educators as well. I mean, I do think there are systems that have figured this out, have worked through their existing labor management agreements to modify. I mean, certainly, like, we're not in the normal course of a collective bargaining agreement in this year. I think the year has put everything on its head. But I've been impressed with a number of superintendents who have really opened the conversation with their unions and also with their communities and with their parents, and said, okay, I'm gonna listen. I'm gonna try to meet people where they need to be, and create some norms that at least will help to support students in this time. So I hope that we can learn from that, certainly for the future. And there's a lot of innovation with respect to labor management that we can look toward for the future as well. We did a lot of work on that when I was in the Obama administration, brought together superintendents and labor leaders from around the country who were showing the way forward.
And yeah,
I'm sure
we have
my
another.
colleagues have thoughts on this topic.
Well, I was just going to say, because there was another question that came in soon after that about, how do we explain having students back in school? How do we explain that would decrease the COVID numbers when we're telling all adults to not go anywhere unnecessarily? So you really see the two sides of the argument.
Yeah, and if our schools are not safe and the pandemic levels are where they are, and we don't have enough PPE for our teachers, and we don't have consistent health and safety guidance and enough testing and tracing in our schools, we shouldn't have our students back in school, right? I mean, that's, we have to, I just think we have to own up to the reality of this pandemic in our communities. We are entering a really challenging time of the year here. And so, should our goal be to try to get our students back to school? Yes, in a safe and healthy way, and in a way that does not compromise their health and safety, that of their families, or that of their teachers. I think that's possible, but it depends on that all depends on the communities in which that we're talking about here, and the resources those communities have to be able to do that well.
I think a worthy goal is to be as inclusive as possible. And I actually think this is a place where you actually see a lot of, I wouldn't call it success, but good work and good faith work. We have options in a lot of places for kids to be remote. We also have options for them to do some in person. That in itself is a pretty significant feat. I know in my town, I was on the return to school task force, and it's pretty formidable what districts we're up against. And so I'm not so sure that we're going to get to something better in the pandemic. I think that we see openings and then closings and then openings and closings. Some of that I think is inevitable. I think we also need to, as we're managing this, be thinking about the question of the future and what does it look like in the future. Every chance I get, I talk about how Al Shanker in the 80s used to propose a 4-day work week for teachers, where that 5th day was students doing extra supports or project-based learning. I can tell you, I am certain, Roberto could probably tell me factually, that there are tens of thousands of teachers post-pandemic who would say, that's my preferred way of working. I, just like everyone else we know, really likes a day a week from home to kind of shift up their work schedule. So what do we do with that? Like, how are we thinking about what this looks like, when everyone has the vaccine, rather than fixating on a problem that we probably can't solve to perfection right now?
Let me move on to the next question, which is the problem with some of the schools that fit the description of offering choice is that some of them are not transparent and are more punitive to students of color for behaviors that are acceptable as normal student behavior in suburban schools. Is there a reporting mechanism that tracks this? Are the schools required to report to the state?
So, I mean, there's a couple things going on in the question. I don't know how schools of choice are being defined here. For instance, Thomas Jefferson in Fairfax County is a public school where you have to submit admission materials and apply to get in. You're not allowed to do that in a charter school. So, there's magnet schools, there's charter schools, there's states with education savings accounts. There's a lot of different mechanisms under which you can organize schools of choice. If folks want to talk about a lack of transparency, I can point them to some of the traditional school districts I've dealt with, which I would argue are anything but transparent. So in any kind of gross characterization, there's a lot of variability. Should schools of choice, however we define it, have to be transparent? Sure. What do we mean by that? I don't know. Certainly if you're collecting federal dollars, you ought to be complying with legal requirements regarding both kind of, how they're being spent and making sure public records are available. But that's not the bigger issue here. For me, it's not. For me, the bigger issue is what we were just talking about. Celine was just mentioning, look, there are some parents who want their kids back in school. And honestly, there's a lot of parents who don't because they're scared. They either feel they live with folks who are over 65, they have members in their household who are highly susceptible to COVID, for whatever reason. And I respect the hell out of that myself. So for me, the point of schools opening their doors is not to tell families you must send your kid, but because there's also a lot of families that are scared to death about what's happening to their kids when they can't go to school. And again, Roberto's cautions are all exactly right. This has got to be done sensibly, safety with an eye to the science, with PPE. What I would argue is that if you look at the science, we've actually not been following it in many places where schools have been closed. But the point here is that families have different circumstances, children have different needs, educators, just the way Celine was talking about it, have different preferences regarding work arrangements and how their work is configured. This suggests to me, I don't know what the texter meant in terms of a label of choice, but what this suggests to me is that we actually are looking at an environment where people want schools to be there for their kids and families in very different ways. Even if we get the accelerated vaccination schedules we're hoping for and looking at Q2 next year, we still know that there's going to be people who don't show up for the second shot. We still know that 30 to 40% of Americans currently say they won't want to get it, which means we're probably looking at something going on, certainly in the next summer, probably in the next fall. Means we're probably having some of these conversations as we start the 21-22 school year. What that points me to is some families have found out that remote learning works really well for their kids. Some kids who felt bullied don't feel bullied now. Some kids who and that's fantastic. And those families aren't going to want to give this up, nor should they. Roberto mentioned pods. Now, pods have been exaggerated. The data I've seen suggests that maybe 5%, 10% of suburban parents at the very outmost have anything that you would vaguely describe like this. But for those families who do, and they find it effective, they're not going to want to let it go. This suggests to me that the way to think about all of this is not this weird debate we've had over school choice. Are you anti-teacher and anti-schools? If, that's the way choice has been depicted by people who don't like it. And people who do like choice talk about failing public schools, blah, blah, blah. seems to me there's actually a pretty sensible place to be, which is kids are different, families have different needs, teachers and educators have different preferences. We need more opportunity to figure out how to serve everybody in this big, messy system going forward. And I don't see any value in saying the choice, whatever it means, is always good or always bad as we wrestle with those challenges.
So John, I think I'm going to wrap us up here,
Yep.
because if I'm not mistaken, we're at time. I want to first and foremost thank our panelists, and I want to share a couple of reflections on this conversation. So I think all of you really have talked about, in one way, shape, or form, finding the center when it comes to approaches to education. And I think really listening to one another and communicating in ways that don't immediately kind of dichotomize the debate. And I think that's a big challenge right now. Speaking personally, am glad to see the new administration talking about listening, serving all, etc. I think that's a start. And I think a lot of the approaches the three of you have alluded to for the future demand much more flexibility on the part of our public systems than we have seen in the past. And as a former system leader, and then knowing something about organizational change, I think the spot that we're in right now, where people are largely afraid of many things, people being parents, kids, educators, and feeling probably at every level underserved, is a hard context from which to spring innovation, and yet that's what we desperately need. So I hope, my fervent hope, is that we can go into this next phase of education, starting with listening in ways that leads to rapid learning and greater flexibility, as opposed to experiencing every change as a loss. Because sometimes I think people think if you're changing what I'm doing, whether it's in the language of a contract or my funding sources, etc., that's automatically a loss. And so the three of you have spurred a lot of thinking for me around how do we bring people together, persuade one another that we're all listening in good faith, and spur innovation from that stronger platform. So with that, I thank you all. I want to thank everyone in the audience. Time is always people's most precious resource. And we are grateful that all of you joined us. John, I want to thank you. I want to thank our colleague, Samantha Kennedy, and also our colleague, Carol Ralph. And again, our partners, Rasky Partners. These events never come off without a team effort. So thank you all so much. Take care. Bye-bye.